Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD, pro physique athlete. Today I'm going to be giving you 10 steps to build your first 10 pounds of muscle. There's a lot of misinformation out there about how you should train, diet, and recover for optimal hypertrophy. And today we're going to cut through all of that and give you some straight up advice to maximize your results. The thing is about starting out with bodybuilding is your beginner gains are actually pretty easy to get, provided that you get your basics right. The problem is a lot of people are misinformed when it comes to the science of bodybuilding. There are a lot of myths out there that people have followed without any scientific basis. Also, there are a lot of confounding factors that might muddy the waters of your information sources. People might be blessed with good genetics, be on performance-enhancing drugs, or just be at a different experience level. And the advice they give you might not work for you at a beginner stage. First step to follow to build your first 10 pounds of muscle is to find an effective workout program. This is really important because it makes sure that you're channeling your efforts in the right direction. You could put in a lot of time and effort, but if you're using a suboptimal program, you're ultimately going to be capped in terms of your results. So what should be in an effective program? Obviously, you can just use one of my free templates on my channel, but in general, you want to be choosing a program that's focused on your compound basic movements with a high overload ceiling. Your 6 main compound movement types, your squat, hip hinge, horizontal push, horizontal pull, vertical push, and vertical pull are going to cover your bases in terms of your main muscle groups, and they'll make sure you get a lot of bang for your buck. You also want to be choosing exercises that have a high overload ceiling. What I mean by this is that there's a large potential for the amount you're able to overload in the long run. If, for example, I chose my main quadriceps movement to be a Bosu ball squat, you're ultimately going to be limited in your gains because you're not going to be able to overload that movement very much. But if you instead choose a barbell back squat, you're basically going to be able to add unlimited weight and you'll only be limited by your ability to build strength. Now, when choosing an effective program, I want you to choose something that's efficient as well. Choose a split that fits consistently into your schedule. I would much rather you start off with a 3-day program that you stick to, rather than trying to hit a 6-day program where you're missing a lot of workouts and ultimately burn out and quit. You don't need very much volume as a beginner to progress well. And I typically recommend just starting off with 3 or 4 days in the gym per week. If you're training 3 days per week, a full body split works really well. And if you're training 4 days per week, upper lower is an easy first pick. Obviously, there are lots of other splits that could work as well, but I'd recommend choosing something that's easy for usability at the beginning. My next recommendation to capture those beginner gains in bodybuilding is to develop excellent technique. Developing good technique is going to be crucial for avoiding injury and producing the most stimulus for each exercise. If you're just starting out with the big compound movements, it might be helpful to get a coach to help you through or get one of your more experienced gym friends to help you. Really focus on building a good base of technique early on. Technique, however, doesn't just stop at the beginner level. You should be trying to develop your technique all throughout your training career. A lot of people stop thinking about technique once they think they've mastered the very basics. But even for myself, I'm still unlocking new little technique tips that are helping me get more out of my movements. And believe it or not, technique can be a limiting factor for people at every level. My next tip for maximizing muscle growth as a beginner is to train consistently, focusing on progressive overload. Consistency and sustainability are king in bodybuilding, and you need to be making those incremental gains over time. I recently had my 16-year-old family friend come up to me and ask what's the secret for building muscle. And I told him the story of Milo, the legendary Greek athlete who carried a newborn calf on his back every day for 4 years training for the Olympics. As the calf grew, he incrementally got stronger with it because he was carrying it every day. And by the end of 4 years, he was able to carry a full-grown cow on his back around the entire stadium. Apparently after that, he killed the cow and ate it, which is kind of rough. But the point of the story is that with progressive overload applied over time, you can get some amazing results. Now, to really reap the benefits of progressive overload, you want to be following a consistent workout program and sticking to that program over time. It really takes months to start seeing gains. You'll see a lot of pro bodybuilders and gym bros talking about switching up their workouts by feel every time. This is not going to be optimal because you need that consistency to really get into the groove of progressive overload. Next tip for maximizing muscle growth when you're starting out is to run the same program until your progress stalls. This is running off the last point where you really want to give your program time with consistent progressive overload to really see gains. People often ask, how long should you run a program for? And an easy answer is that if you're making good progress, just keep running it. Obviously, if you find that a certain exercise doesn't work well for you, cause you pain, or you don't feel a burn or a pump using it, then you might make substitutions as necessary. But when you start a new program, you really need to think about it as an experiment that takes months to actually pay off. And you don't really see the results of the variables that you've set until the end of those few months. This does take a lot of patience. Learn to get your satisfaction from making those small incremental gains every week. Next recommendation for maximizing your hypertrophy gains is to get in 0.7 to 1.0 grams per pound of body weight of protein per day. Upping your protein in your diet is probably the first change most people need to make in terms of their nutrition for hypertrophy. But with the science we have, the lower limit of 0.7 grams per pound of body weight actually isn't that high. And I think that's one of the big values that science has brought us, in that you don't need to be having half a chicken every meal. And more protein isn't always better. Make it a habit of always having some sort of protein source with every meal. Once you get into the routine of building balanced meals that contain protein, it will get easier and easier and eventually just become second nature. The recommendation is based on pounds of body weight, and this is assuming you're in a sort of normal body fat percentage range. It doesn't necessarily have to be your bone dry, shredded, lean body mass. If you're obese, a trick you could also use to estimate your protein intake is to use grams per centimeter of height. If you want to optimize your hypertrophy from a nutrition standpoint, you should learn to track calories and ideally also macros. Tracking your calories, or at least getting a sense of what you're eating, is going to be really useful for understanding calorie balance. A good beginner recommendation would be to start off with a food diary. So log everything that you eat over a few days and then look up the calorie and macro contents using Google. You can use a spreadsheet or an app like MyFitnessPal to help you calculate. You don't need to be tracking your calories and macros rigorously for the rest of your life, but doing periodic audits can be helpful. Ultimately, you want to have looked up enough nutrition facts so that you can eyeball macros in your head. Now, if you're just starting out, the main things you want to get a handle on is your protein intake and your calorie intake. The exact macro partitioning between carbs and fats doesn't matter a whole lot. It might make a difference at a more advanced level, but getting a sense of protein and calories is critical. My next tip for maximizing beginner muscle growth is to eat regularly 4 to 6 times per day. There are 2 parts to this. First of all, eating regularly is going to be really helpful because it will help you build a structure for your diet and will help to regulate hunger. A lot of people have trouble sticking to a nutrition plan because they have very unpredictable eating habits. They end up skipping a few meals, then get really hungry and end up binging on foods that they didn't intend. When you have a regular eating routine, you're able to build structures around meals that you know will get you the macros and calories that you need. I typically recommend trying to spread out your protein over 4 to 6 meals per day, ideally with about even amounts of protein in each. This will make sure that you have the available resources around to build muscle, and should make sure you cover your bases for mealtime. My next tip for maximizing muscle growth as a beginner has to do with your calorie balance. So I'd recommend going with a lean bulking strategy if you're less than 15% body fat for men or 25% body fat for women. And if you're above those body fat percentage ranges, you could consider going for a body recomposition approach. I typically recommend people try and stay on the leaner end of body fat percentage ranges, somewhere between 10 to 15% body fat for men and 18 to 25% for women. So if you're already within this range, like below the upper end of 15 or 25%, then I'd recommend going for a lean bulk. That is, getting into a conservative surplus. Bulking is ideal for muscle growth because a surplus is very friendly for hypertrophy. It basically signals to your body that times are abundant and it's a good time to build. The thing about bulking that a lot of people get wrong though is that there's a maximum rate at which you're able to build muscle, and any weight gain beyond that rate is going to be fat. You don't want to be putting on too much excess fat because you're going to eventually have to lose it. If you're a beginner, I'd recommend gaining weight at a rate of about 1 to 1.5% of your body weight gained per month. So if you weigh 200 pounds, gaining 1% of your weight per month would be 2 pounds per month, or half a pound per week. This should be enough to maximize muscle gains without putting on too much excess fat. If you're starting out over this body fat percentage range, you could start off with a body recomposition strategy. This is where you try to build muscle and lose fat at the same time. A lot of people say that this isn't a viable strategy, but body recomposition has been demonstrated in numerous scientific studies. If you want to recomp, basically set your calories to around maintenance or in a slight deficit. Beginners can still continue to build muscle even if they're in deficits of up to 0.5 to 1.5% of your body weight loss per week. This is because as a beginner, you're so sensitive to the training stimulus and the higher protein diet that you're gonna make gains regardless. So if you're at the higher end of body fat percentage, don't be afraid to put yourself into a deficit. If you're training well, you'll still build muscle. I've given these recommendations because if you're on the upper end of body fat percentage, you probably don't want to be really bulking because your body fat is going to go up. But if you're on the leaner end, I do think it's a good idea to start off with a bulking strategy. At some point, if you want to get big, you will have to put on weight. And ultimately, a bulking and cutting strategy is going to give you faster results. Next tip, if you're trying to build muscle for a beginner, is to weigh yourself regularly. The scale is a very useful tool to help track your progress. This is because the best estimate of your calorie balance is your actual scale weight change over time. If your weight is staying stable, that is by definition maintenance. And I would much rather that you use a scale weight to guide changes rather than some BMR calculator online. You should be guiding your bulking or cutting nutrition based on changes in your scale weight. Aim to have weekly targets for bulking or cutting in terms of your weight change. And at the start, I'd recommend weighing yourself daily and using a weekly average. As you get more experience, you may not need to weigh yourself every day, but weighing yourself regularly will be helpful. This will also help to make sure you don't go way off track with a crazy dirty bulk. Taking weekly averages will also help to get around the noise created by fluctuations in your daily weight. A lot of things can affect your scale weight from day to day, including your activity, food volume, salt intake, and fluid intake. And if you're not very experienced, it might be difficult to track your changes if just looking at it from day to day. Our 10th tip for building your first 10 pounds of muscle is an underrated one, and that is to improve sleep hygiene. When it comes to bodybuilding, recovery is hugely underrated. And first, you want to make sure you're getting enough sleep, at least 7 to 8 hours per night. But once you have enough sleep, you want to improve your sleep quality. Sleep hygiene is something we recommend as doctors to patients. And it's basically a set of practices that teaches your body to sleep when you want it to. A central part of this is having a regular routine for bed. So you ideally want to go to sleep at the same time and get up at the same time every day. This helps to set your internal clock so you get sleepy when it comes to bedtime hour. Next, you want to have a pre-bed routine. So this means having a ritual of activities that you always do before bed. When you have a regular routine of activities, it will signal to your body that it's time to sleep when you go through that ritual. Next, you want to make your bed a sleeping sanctuary. So only use your bed for sleep and sex, and avoid doing awake activities in bed, like being on your phone, doing work, or watching TV. The problem with doing these activities when you're in bed is that it teaches your body that the bed is a place to be awake. Being awake in bed also applies to not being able to sleep. So if you find yourself tossing and turning for more than 30 minutes and you can't sleep, I'd recommend actually getting yourself physically out of bed and doing some sort of relaxing activity before trying to go back to bed. I think improving your sleep quality is going to be huge for maximizing your hypertrophy results. If you're struggling to find a good split for your first bodybuilding program, check out this playlist where I go through some of my favorite splits and the pros and cons of each of them. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.